Hello, I would like to share with you some ideas about human rights and psychology. What are human rights? Human rights are rights that belong to every human being without distinction of any kind, such as sex, color, religion, social origin, and so forth. The underlying document is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly 70 years ago in 1948. The Universal Declaration consists of 30 articles with more than 100 single rights. Human rights are characterized by the Universal Declaration as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations. Included are civic and political rights such as the right to life and security, prohibition of torture and slavery, right to a just and public trial, right to seek asylum, right to freedom of opinion and religion, right to peaceful assembly and periodic elections. Also included in the Universal Declaration are social, economic and cultural rights, such as the right to work and to protection against unemployment, the right to equal pay for equal work and to limitation of working hours and periodic holidays, to form and to join trade unions, the right to a salary ensuring a dignified life, and, as Article 25 says, the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being, including food, clothing, housing and medical care, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, and so on. Additional, education shall be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages. The basic principles of human rights are universality, they apply to all humans, and indivisibility, all human rights are important and interrelated. In the following section, I will show that psychology may contribute strongly to the advancement of human rights. I will discuss four aspects: knowledge about and attitudes towards human rights violations and misuse, and human rights education. First, knowledge and attitudes. Knowledge about human rights can be an important guide to decide for normative, adequate decisions and behavior. My psychology colleagues Jost Stellmacher and Elmar Brähler and I conducted 2 representative studies in Germany. One important result was that the great majority of people asked consider human rights and their implementation as very important. This means that the attitude towards human rights is a positive one. However, on the other hand, knowledge about human rights was found to be marginal and inaccurate. When asked, participants in the survey were able to name only 3 of the more than 100 rights of the Universal Declaration spontaneously. These were often freedom of opinion and freedom of religion. Also, economic and social rights were hardly known at all, or they were even explicitly considered as being no human rights by the majority. For instance, the right to form trade unions, equal pay for equal work, periodic holidays, or protection against unemployment. In addition, international studies summarized by US psychologist Sam McFarland show that support for human rights strongly differs with different systems. For instance, US Americans support civic rights like freedom of speech and religion much more than citizens of most other states. On the other hand, people in China or Argentina support economic and social rights much more than US citizens. These examples show that historic and national values and interests have a great influence on the attitude toward human rights. How can we explain these results on knowledge and attitudes? First of all, the media are very important to construct our view of the world. Jost Stellmacher and I repeatedly analyzed leading German newspapers as well as German TV news. These are the most important results. Reports are often very general and do not specify human rights at all. If human rights are specified, usually only some civic and political rights are mentioned. Mainly non-Western states are criticized for violation of human rights. Germany and other Western states are characterized implicitly or explicitly as guardians of human rights. Thus, societal interests and ideologies are reflected by the media. In addition, analyses of textbooks used in schools showed, amongst others, that the importance of NGOs like Amnesty International, Oxfam, Food First, Peace Brigades International or Greenpeace is rarely covered at all. Also, the world economic system is discussed critically in the textbooks, e.g. hunger, poverty or child labor, but interesting enough, these topics were not characterized as a violation of human rights. This leads us to the next topic, human rights violations. The Universal Declaration is a standard of achievement and quite comprehensive, and every state violates human rights to a smaller or greater extent. Well known are the annual reports of Amnesty International that state nations and their human rights violations, such as restriction of freedom of opinion, having political prisoners, or applying torture. According to different indices of human rights violations, Germany and other Western states achieved a positive high ranking. Indeed, they achieved a lot in implementing human rights. However, in my opinion, this does not mean that they do not violate human rights, or at least are involved in human rights violations to a considerable extent. To name just a few examples. During the so-called War on Terror, civic rights were heavily restricted. For instance, torture was applied in many cases, notorious are Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo. The National Defense Authorization Act allows US authorities to detain citizens indefinitely. Killing by drones beyond a declared war violates the right to a fair trial as well as the right to life. The intent of regime change, as executed in Libya or Iraq, and as intended in Cuba, Syria or Iran, violates the UN Charter as well as Article 1 of the Human Rights Covenants from 1966, which state that all peoples have the right of self-determination, including their political status and their economic, social and cultural development. Also in the European Union, the USA or Australia, the right of asylum is heavily restricted and thousands of refugees die on their way to Europe. All over the world, a considerable amount of discrimination has been developed, including racism, xenophobia and anti-Semitism. Many goods sold in the North are produced in countries of the Third World under degrading working conditions, which cause disease and are not sufficient to afford a decent life. Only some weeks ago, Germany was criticized by United Nations Economic and Social Council, amongst others, because of the negative impact of agricultural exports to poor countries, not sufficient efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the large number of people working in precarious employment, many being paid beyond the minimum wage, and the shortage of affordable housing. I'm still giving examples of human rights violations. Highly industrialized countries in the North are mainly responsible for climate change, but the life of millions of people in the South is endangered. In recent years, the number of people suffering from hunger has decreased substantially. However, still more than 800 million people worldwide suffer from undernourishment, and every 10 seconds a child under the age of 5 dies because of hunger. This is more than 8,000 children every day. The former special UN rapporteur for the human right to food, Swiss sociologist John Ziegler, mainly holds the current neoliberal world trade system responsible for this. The current system violates Article 28 of the Universal Declaration stating, "Everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized." This means that according to Article 28, human rights should and must be the guidance for national and international politics. I will later elaborate on wars as a major cause for human rights violations. These examples show that human rights violations are not only committed by those states that are commonly mentioned and accused by Western media and political representatives like Russia, China, Turkey, Venezuela or Libya. Western states are involved in, if not responsible for, significant human rights violations. Nevertheless, our empirical studies in Germany show that Germany and allied Western states are perceived by the general public as being guardians of human rights. How might this be explained? The social identity approach by Taschereau and Turner states that people strive for a positive self-concept. This is partly based on the membership in specific groups, e.g. family or the nation. To enhance one's self-concept, the status of the in-groups is enhanced, while that of the out-groups is degraded. Thus, enhancing the image of the nation we belong to by emphasizing its positive impact on human rights will enhance our self-concept too. These processes of enhancing and degrading are relevant aspects of political propaganda as well. In addition, a great number of psychological studies show the importance of individual differences in relation to human rights. Macfarlane's concept of identification with all humanity is positively correlated, whereas substantial negative correlations exist with generalized prejudice, authoritarianism, as well as social dominance orientation. Misuses of human rights. The concept of misuse is little discussed so far. We distinguish between three kinds of misuse. First, selective presentation. When human rights are reduced habitually to some civic and political rights, whereas economic and social rights are neglected, then the principle of indivisibility is violated, and this produces a distorted perception and evaluation of human rights. Secondly, selective critique. When human rights violations are depicted mainly in foreign states and not within the home state and its allies, then the principle of universality is violated as human rights apply to every human being. Therefore, human rights violations should be criticized and confronted wherever they occur. This problem is demonstrated in empirical studies too. Human rights violations are accepted by the respondents more likely when they are conducted by the home government compared to a different government. The most important misuse, however, is the justification of wars with presumed human rights violations. After the end of the East-West conflict, Western nations repeatedly accused certain states for violating human rights. Thus, enemy images were constructed and intensified, and wars were reinitiated. Examples are the Yugoslavia-Kosovo War and wars against Iraq, Libya and Syria. However, when arguments and documents are analyzed carefully, it is obvious that other reasons were at least as relevant as the protection of human rights, e.g. economic reasons like securing of commodities, or geopolitical reasons like implementing pro-Western governments. Additionally, wars usually do not prevent human rights violations, but on the contrary, they increase violations to a great extent. To give you an example, I will show this with the Iraq War, which started in 2003. As is well documented, meanwhile, this war was justified by the US government with fake news, and this war was a violation of the UN Charter. As is common in wars, the right to life was heavily violated. It is documented by the IPPNW that about 4,000 US soldiers were killed and about 10,000 Iraqi soldiers, and at least 200,000 civilians. A US study by the Brown University of Rhode Island published only a week ago estimations about 500,000 fatalities, but probably very many more during the war on terror in Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan. Moreover, about 500,000 soldiers in Iraq developed mental illnesses, especially depression, post-traumatic stress disorders, and addictions. Reliable data for the general population is sparse. Additionally, the infrastructure of Iraq was destroyed, and the war produced a large number of terrorists, thus leading to further human rights violation. The Iraq War is just one example showing that wars, especially justified with the protection of human rights, will very likely lead to massive human rights violations. Is it remarkable that wars and their foundation, such as military expenditure or export of arms, are rarely discussed under the perspective of human rights violations? The last point I will shortly comment in human rights education. The former UN General Secretary Kofi Annan emphasized the importance of knowledge about human rights in his Message for Human Rights Day 2000. Only when people are educated about human rights can we hope to prevent human rights violations. A sound human rights education is necessary in order to strive for their implementation and against their violations. People must know and understand the rights, and they must demand them. Three core components of human rights education are distinguished. Firstly, teaching of knowledge. Secondly, enhancing positive attitudes toward human rights. This includes, in my opinion, empathy and universalism. And thirdly, teaching competencies to support and implement human rights. These components illustrate the great relevance of psychology. The already existing approaches of human rights educating are promising. However, there is a lack of adequate evaluations. This may be another task for psychology. To conclude my presentation, in my opinion, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is one of the most important written documents in mankind. For the first time in human history, the international community agreed that the rights outlined in this document belong to every human being with the core idea of equal and inalienable dignity. To reach the outlined common standard of achievement, a great diversity of actors may and should contribute, like the United Nations, NGOs, governments, communities, scientific, cultural or sports organizations, companies, the media and the public. While there are considerable gains in the protection and promotion of human rights, these are under attack in many places, as I have demonstrated. There is a risk that these gains may be reversed. Psychology, too, can contribute to implementing human rights. EFPA, the European Federation of Psychologists Associations, through its Board of Human Rights and Psychology, made a commitment to strongly articulate psychologists' responsibilities for human rights promotion and protection in order to respect human dignity and well-being. Examples of this commitment may be identifying and confronting human rights violations, e.g. with experts' opinions, psychological and psychotherapeutic help for victims of human rights violations, promoting human rights education, e.g. with developing and evaluating according curricula, research, publications, public statements and lectures on human rights. Thank you for listening.